in the quiet countryside of Fair Hollow, nestled beyond the pine-draped hills of upstate Vermont, 34-year-old Henry Carter never imagined he'd be forced into a legal battle over land that had belonged to his family for generations. A marketing executive living in bustling Seattle, Henry hadn't visited his late grandfather's farmland in years. That all changed the morning he received a frantic call from Grace Whitaker, a neighbor who had known his grandfather for over 4 decades. "They're bulldozing your grandfather's east fields," she said, voice trembling. "Big machines showed up yesterday. You need to come now." Confused and alarmed, Henry packed a bag and drove cross-country to Willowshade Farm, the 220-acre property he'd inherited after Grandpa Raymond passed away last spring. But what greeted him wasn't nostalgia. It was destruction. Bulldozers tore through the once rich soil, and signs for Silver Ridge Estates, 96 luxury homes, starting at $475K, were posted at every corner. The peaceful farmland that had raised 3 generations of Carters was now at the mercy of a homeowners association, led by the polished yet cold Victoria Langford. Henry's gut told him something was deeply wrong, and as he'd soon discover, the past held secrets powerful enough to stop the future dead in its tracks. Henry didn't waste a second. As the dust from the construction site coated the windshield of his car, he sped down the gravel road, leading to the farmhouse where he had spent every childhood summer. The place felt different, foreign even. Where once wildflowers danced in the wind, now stood orange stakes, spray-painted lines, and mechanical beasts devouring the land. He parked beside the sagging porch and was greeted by Grace Whitaker, still clutching a worn photo of Grandpa Raymond and a pitcher of iced tea. Her eyes brimmed with worry. "They've been coming around for months," she said. "Raymond knew something wasn't right. Said they were trying to steal it." Henry's heart pounded. He pushed open the door to his grandfather's study, a room frozen in time. The scent of pipe smoke and old pine bookshelves hit him like a memory. Everywhere were maps, receipts, journals. Raymond had documented everything. And then he saw it. A slightly raised floorboard beneath the desk. Inside the hidden space was a metal box secured with a key hanging beneath the desk. Henry opened it with trembling hands. Inside lay his grandfather's original land surveys, aged and yellowed but clearly marked. There was also a letter, written in his grandfather's precise cursive. "If you're reading this, Henry, then the people I feared finally made their move. They'll tell you I sold the land. I didn't. I never would. Check the 1921 survey against what the county says today. They moved the boundaries. Stole our land with ink and lies." Henry's jaw clenched. He laid the surveys beside the modern development maps. Sure enough, there was a discrepancy. 80 full acres missing from the current records, including the very land where bulldozers now roared. Even worse, part of Silver Ridge's existing community center, and over a dozen completed homes, were built on what legally belonged to the Carters. He didn't sleep that night. He drove to town at dawn and barged into the law office of Samuel Whitmore, a semi-retired local property attorney with white hair and kind eyes. "I need help," Henry said, laying out the documents. Samuel studied them quietly, his eyes widening. "This is no clerical error," he finally said. "This is fraud." Samuel immediately filed for an emergency injunction to stop all construction. He also called in a certified land surveyor to verify the old maps. Meanwhile, Henry combed through the county's public archives and uncovered a tangled web of shady deals, forged easements, and paper-thin transactions. Every thread led back to one name: Victoria Langford, president of the Silver Ridge HOA, and wife of the town's planning commissioner. The final straw came when Henry found a document filed just 3 months ago, a $16 million construction loan secured by using the disputed land, his land, as collateral. He stared out over the bulldozers parked silently under the morning fog and whispered to the memory of his grandfather, "You were right, and now it's my turn to finish this fight." 3 days after filing the injunction, Henry received the call that changed everything. "They blocked your driveway," said Samuel Whitmore, voice tight with disbelief. "You need to get back to the farm, now." Henry rushed home to find 3 white SUVs, emblazoned with Silver Ridge security logos, parked across his driveway. A man in a black polo shirt handed him a thick envelope without a word. Inside was a cease and desist letter from the HOA's legal team, accusing Henry of fraud, trespassing, and attempting to destabilize a lawful community. They demanded he withdraw all claims or face legal action and financial restitution. "You've got to be kidding me," Henry muttered, storming past the SUVs toward the house. But the hits kept coming. When he tried to call for a pizza that night, the driver claimed the address no longer existed in their system. The next morning, the water pressure dropped to nothing. By noon, the electricity flickered out. He wasn't just being stonewalled. He was being isolated. Methodically, his phone rang. The screen flashed with an unfamiliar number. Against his better judgment, Henry answered. "Enjoying the view?" Victoria Langford's saccharine voice oozed through the line. "I told you, you have no idea who you're dealing with." "This is harassment," he said through gritted teeth. "This is power, sweetheart. You're one man. I have the county in my back pocket." Then came the final blow. She whispered, "Tomorrow, your farmhouse will be condemned for unsafe wiring, septic violations, and non-compliant porch railings, and good luck finding a contractor. None of them work against Silver Ridge." Click. Henry stood there in the silence of his grandfather's kitchen, staring at the dimming lights and the spoiled food in the fridge. The farmhouse, his safe place, was becoming a prison, but then a glimmer of hope. That evening, headlights cut through the fog as a car crept up the gravel road, slipping past the concrete barriers placed by HOA security. Henry tensed, ready for another showdown. But instead, a familiar face stepped out of the vehicle. Gerald Moore, treasurer of the Silver Ridge HOA. "I shouldn't be here," he whispered, glancing nervously at the guards in the distance. "But I brought something." From his coat pocket, he pulled a flash drive and placed it in Henry's hand. "I've been keeping records for 7 years. The things Victoria's been doing, you need to see them." Inside, by the dim light of a desk lamp, Gerald opened a laptop and showed Henry financial statements, invoices, and emails. Money was missing. Hundreds of thousands in HOA fees, rerouted to shell companies tied to Victoria's relatives. Landscaping contracts awarded to her nephew. Security services billed double. Legal fees padded beyond belief. Henry leaned back, stunned. "She's been bleeding this community dry," Gerald had said quietly. "People are scared. But you've given them a reason to fight." For the first time, Henry didn't feel alone. Victoria thought she could cut him off. Instead, she'd awakened a movement. Henry stood on the porch of his grandfather's farmhouse, arms crossed, staring out at the construction zone in the distance. The soft hum of crickets couldn't drown out the low growl of an excavator idling near the tree line. But something had changed. Not out there, but within him. He wasn't just fighting for land anymore. He was fighting for truth. For a community that had been manipulated into silence. For people like Gerald, Grace, and the dozens of families suffering under the polished grip of Victoria Langford. The next morning, Henry began knocking on doors. At first, residents of Silver Ridge peeked through curtains, hesitant and guarded. Some wouldn't open the door. Others opened it only a crack. But Henry didn't come empty-handed. He carried copies of the original 1921 survey. A short letter explaining the land dispute, and, most importantly, the story of how their HOA fees were being siphoned away. "I'm not trying to take anyone's home," he said to the elderly Martinez couple, whose backyard garden had been torn up by HOA enforcers. "I'm trying to stop one woman from taking everything from all of us." Word spread fast. By nightfall, Henry's phone buzzed non-stop. Messages from homeowners rolled in. "We got fined $500 for painting our shutters red. They removed my son's swing set, said it was a violation. Victoria threatened to report me to child services over a trampoline." Each voice added fuel to a fire Henry hadn't realized he was building. The tipping point came when Sarah Whitaker, Grace's daughter-in-law and a young mother of 2, invited him in for coffee. "She made us rip out our raised vegetable beds," Sarah said bitterly. "Said they didn't meet aesthetic standards. My husband works double shifts. All I wanted was to grow tomatoes with my kids." Henry looked at her tear-streaked cheeks and knew. This fight wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to everyone who'd been bullied into silence. He called Samuel Whitmore that night. "I want to form a coalition," he said. "A new HOA, one that's built by the community, not ruled by one woman." Samuel chuckled. "That's bold. But legally, if you own the land beneath Silver Ridge, you can absolutely establish an alternative HOA. The law is on your side." Henry printed 200 flyers. "Emergency community meeting. Your home may be at risk." He reserved the local school gym, ironically located on land that had once belonged to his grandfather. That evening, the gym overflowed. Nearly 100 families showed up, tired of being silenced, fined, manipulated. Victoria arrived late, her red blazer blazing like a warning. "This meeting is unauthorized," she snapped. "Leave now." But no one moved. And when Gerald Moore stepped to Henry's side, holding a binder labeled HOA Financials, the room broke into applause. Henry walked to the front and took the microphone. "I'm not just fighting for a boundary line. I'm fighting for the heart of this community. And I know now. My grandfather didn't just leave me land. He left me a mission." The morning after the gym meeting, Henry woke to something he hadn't felt in weeks. Momentum. His phone was buzzing before sunrise. Messages flooded in from families who had once been too afraid to speak. People were ready, not just to stand up, but to take back control. His first move was bold. He walked into the Silver Ridge Community Center, folder in hand, and politely informed the stunned receptionist that the HOA no longer had exclusive access to the building. "This structure," he said calmly, "sits on land I now legally control. We'll be using it for an emergency residence meeting tonight." She reached for the phone, likely to call Victoria, but Henry was already out the door, back at the farmhouse. He worked alongside Gerald Moore and Samuel Whitmore to draft what they would call the Meadow Hollow Coalition Charter, a new homeowners agreement built on transparency, fairness, and community input. No more surprise fines. No more secret bank accounts. Every dollar collected would be accounted for, and every decision would require community votes. By sunset, the community center was standing room only. Parents brought kids. Elderly residents held hands nervously. People whispered, worried, hopeful. Victoria arrived, of course, late, furious, flanked by 2 men in suits. "This is a joke," she snapped. "Yeah, seat," marching down the aisle. "You're all trespassing." "No," Henry said firmly from the stage. "We're homeowners, on land that legally belongs to us. And this is the beginning of something better." He clicked on the projector behind him. Slide after slide appeared. HOA fees being funneled into fake consulting firms, a landscaping company owned by Victoria's brother, dozens of special assessments that didn't match actual repair costs. Gasps filled the room. Some people covered their mouths. Others stood, faces red with anger. And then came the most powerful moment. Henry Turkyung turned to a page in the binder and held it up. "This," he said, "is the land deed showing your homes sit on land my grandfather never sold. That development loan, that 16 million mortgage, it's backed by land that was stolen." Silence. Even Victoria looked shaken. "But I'm not here to tear down your homes," Henry continued. "I'm here to offer a new foundation, one built on truth, on respect, on shared purpose. Let's form a new association. Let's reclaim this place, not just physically, but morally." An elderly woman stood. "Can we really do that?" Henry nodded. "With enough signatures, yes. With enough unity, absolutely." One by one, people walked to the front of the room and added their names to the charter. By the end of the night, 91 families had joined the Meadow Hollow Coalition. Victoria stormed out, swearing under her breath, but Henry didn't follow her. He sat at the edge of the stage, watching children laugh and parents exchange relieved smiles. Something was changing. Something real. The land had always been valuable. But now, for the first time in years, so was the community on it. Henry used to think strength was found in silence, in enduring, in not making waves. But standing in front of a coalition of nearly 100 families, facing down a woman who wielded political favors like weapons, he realized something deeper. True strength is standing up, especially when you're outnumbered. The days following the community center meeting moved like wildfire. With the help of Gerald Moore and a handful of newly recruited volunteers, retirees, teachers, small business owners, Henry launched the Meadow Hollow Coalition office right out of his grandfather's old barn. The smell of hay and aged wood still lingered, but it was quickly replaced by printer ink and stacks of documents. Tables were filled with laptops, posters, and, most importantly, hope. What surprised Henry most was how his own role evolved. He wasn't just the landowner anymore. People now turned to him for guidance. The once quiet city boy who barely visited the farm was now a symbol of resistance. "I just wanted to protect my grandfather's land," he confessed to Grace Whitaker one afternoon as she brought over fresh-baked muffins. "Now, I'm leading a movement. Grace smiled and patted his shoulder. Raymond always said you had fire in you. You just needed the right kindling. But leadership wasn't easy. Victoria Langford struck back with everything she had. HOA security began harassing families who joined the coalition. Some received anonymous threats. Others got compliance notices every other day. Henry's farmhouse was cited for so many violations that county inspectors practically lived there. And yet, he didn't back down. When the county health department shut off his water, Henry and his team set up portable tanks. When power was mysteriously cut for maintenance, solar-powered generators lit the barn through the night. Every attack only strengthened the coalition's resolve. But the greatest change happened within Henry himself. He learned how to speak at town hall meetings without shaking. He studied property law late into the night. Not because he had to, but because people were counting on him. And when local media started picking up the story, Henry didn't hide from the cameras. He stood tall, holding up his grandfather's old survey maps, like battle flags. He'd also begun reconnecting with the town, with the land, and with himself. He started waking up at dawn, walking the fields in silence, watching the mist roll over the hills like a breath from the earth itself. This farm wasn't just soil and memory anymore. It was his purpose. What began as a fight over acreage had transformed into a mission of justice. By the end of the month, with legal pressure mounting and support for the coalition reaching 200 households, the county began a formal investigation into Silver Ridge's development permits. And for the first time, Victoria Langford was nowhere to be seen. Henry stood outside the barn that night, looking up at the stars, feeling his grandfather's presence in the rustling wind. "You planted seeds," he whispered. "I'm just helping them grow." 6 months later, the view from the front porch of Henry's grandfather's farmhouse had changed, but not in the way Victoria Langford had imagined. Gone were the bulldozers. The chain-link fences had been removed. The noisy construction trailers had vanished. In their place stood a vibrant, unified neighborhood, alive with color and character. Children rode their bikes along winding paths. Garden boxes overflowed with tomatoes and peppers. Porch swings creaked under the weight of laughter and stories. And right in the middle of it all, where Victoria had once envisioned a gated pool, stood the Meadow Hollow Community Garden, proudly maintained by the very residents who once feared speaking up. It hadn't been easy. After the investigation confirmed the forged boundary documents, the county nullified all development permits issued to Silver Ridge HOA. Victoria Langford was indicted on multiple counts of fraud, misuse of HOA funds, and conspiracy to falsify county records. She accepted a plea deal to avoid jail time, but her reputation and her power were gone. What followed was remarkable. Instead of turning the victory into vengeance, Henry made a choice that surprised everyone, including himself. He offered to work with the homeowners whose houses sat on disputed land. With his legal claim now indisputable, Henry could have demanded they vacate. Instead, he sat down with each family one by one and renegotiated fair, permanent ownership agreements, ensuring they could keep their homes legally, with no fear of losing them again. "I'm not here to take anything from you," he told one couple who had saved for 10 years to buy their first home. "I'm here to give you something no one else ever offered: peace of mind." That choice changed everything. the new Meadow Hollow Coalition expanded, bringing in over 300 residents who voted on transparent budgeting, optional community participation, and preservation of the land. The wetlands behind the neighborhood, once slated for destruction, were granted protected conservation status, thanks to environmental research found in Henry's grandfather's journals. They named the area Raymond's Hollow. The farmhouse itself was renovated and turned into the community's heart, a place for meetings, events, and Saturday pancake breakfasts. Inside the old study, Henry kept his grandfather's letters framed on the wall. "I think he'd be proud," Henry told Grace one afternoon, handing her a glass of iced tea on the porch. She nodded. "He wouldn't just be proud, he'd be grateful. Grateful that you didn't just protect what was his, but made it better." Henry looked out across the fields, where kids were now planting wildflowers, and families were painting garden signs together. The land had been saved, but more importantly, the people had been awakened. And as the sun dipped below the Vermont hills, casting golden light across the rooftops of a once divided community, now rebuilt on unity, Henry finally understood. This wasn't just a victory over injustice. It was the beginning of something beautiful. Sometimes the fiercest battles aren't fought with fists or fury, but with truth, patience, and community. Henry Carter's journey began as a personal quest to protect his grandfather's land. What he uncovered was a tangled web of corruption, fear, and manipulation that had gone unchecked for years. But instead of letting anger consume him, Henry chose a different path. He listened. He organized. He empowered others who had been silenced. The greatest trap he ever set wasn't for revenge. It was for restoration. He turned resistance into rebuilding, conflict into cooperation. In doing so, he proved that one person, armed with conviction and compassion, can ignite a movement, challenge injustice, and restore dignity where it's been stripped away. The lesson is clear. Power may intimidate, but it cannot outlast truth. And when people unite around that truth, they don't just reclaim land, they reclaim their identity, their future, and their voice. This story reflects real challenges many face in communities as dominated by unfair HOAs or corrupt developers. If you suspect fraud, start with documentation. Pull original land surveys. Review public records and connect with a trusted property lawyer. If you're not alone, organize. Form coalitions. Educate neighbors. And use your voice at town halls or local media. Corruption thrives in silence. But one well-informed, determined person can shift everything. Even if you're not facing a land dispute, this story reminds us to question power, protect legacy, and speak up for those who can't. Sometimes the land you're saving isn't just soil, it's the soul of your community.